sort of trying to figure out what is reality. If everything I've always believed isn't necessarily true, then what is true? And I think when unlearning is part of our learning, learning becomes confusing. Because sometimes it's almost like this Nova effect, where you have a million different questions going in a million different directions, and it can be unclear which ones matter the most. They all feel super urgent and challenging to know kind of how to move forward and how to figure out a sort of a path out of the wilderness, right? How do you find a way out of the free fall? And so that's really what steps 3 and 4, especially step 3, are all about. That what follows in a spiritual crisis is sort of a significant deconstruction process. But the question is, how do you begin the project of reconstruction, of getting a solid understanding of life, of reality, on the other side of a spiritual crisis? So when it comes to step 3, I think one key idea is that you stop the bleeding by learning how to think, not what to think. That sometimes the tendency can be to look for someone who will just provide answers. And I think the truth is there's a comfort in that, but sometimes that can be almost like the age-old adage or metaphor of putting a Band-Aid on a wound that actually needs something much more significant, something that needs surgery or stitches or something like that. When someone only ever offers answers without ever teaching how to think, I think a lot of times what we're being set up for with a teacher like that is someone who's kind of leading us in the direction of just another spiritual crisis, another spiritual emergency. And that's why learning how to think is far more about questions than it ever is answers. Not that answers aren't significant, but I think the first question is not what are the right answers, but the first question is what are the right questions. And so what I want to do is, in kind of breaking down step number 3, stop and believe, I want to look at another story from the Bible. So we looked at Paul for steps 1 and 2. For step 3, I want to look at Thomas, the one who's often dubbed Doubting Thomas, one of the disciples of Jesus. And I think we could more honorably retitle him Thinking Thomas, because I think in his story, we actually get a picture of what it looks like to begin to reconstruct an understanding of reality on the other side of a spiritual crisis. And so, in getting into it, there's some other passages that lead up to it, but for sake of time, I want to jump ahead a little bit to right here. Okay, so any Taco Bell fans in the room? Is anybody? All right, okay, there we go. Good stuff. So I have a friend who loves, there are only 2 in a room this size. I just feel like that says something. So I have a friend who loves Taco Bell, and he has tried to convince me in the past that it is a legitimate restaurant. He knows full well. He acknowledges that it's not a Mexican restaurant. He says that full well, and yet he still loves it and enjoys it. But for the life of me, I just can't get on board with him. And so, in a way, I think that this experience of Thomas is similar to that, where his friends are trying to convince him of something that he believes is not true, that he doesn't have enough evidence to reach the conclusion himself that this is in fact true. And yet in this, you see the questions that he's asking, the ones that are most significant for him, and you even see the way that he responds when he's presented with the evidence that matters most. And so in the passage, this is what we see. John chapter 20, looking at verse 24. Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12 disciples of Jesus, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. This is on the other side of Jesus' death and resurrection. So the other disciples, they interacted with Jesus on the other side of his resurrection. And they're trying to tell him, right? The other disciples tell him, we've seen the Lord. But he says to them, unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. That's Thomas basically laying out the evidence that he needs in order to reach the conclusion about Jesus being risen back to life. It says a week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them this time. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. And then he said to Thomas, put your finger here, see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. And Thomas said to him, my Lord and my God. And then Jesus told him, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. And I think this passage is really interesting because within it, you get to see what Thomas's most significant questions are, even his most important question. that it's all about whether or not Jesus has actually risen from the grave. Because he knows that he died. But the question is, has he risen back to life? And if so, what does that mean? And in the story, we get to see him presented with the evidence that he needs in order to reach that conclusion. And in response, when he gets that evidence, his question is answered. And his response is really an acknowledgement of who Jesus is. He says, "My Lord and my God," acknowledging Jesus as the highest authority in all of reality. And I think what's also important to understand is Jesus' words at the end of this passage, verse 29, that he's not necessarily saying, blessed are those who believe in me, who trust in me without evidence, without questions, without thinking. But I think rather it's an encouragement to those who perhaps have to think even harder according to different evidence, other than what Thomas was presented with himself. And I think what that tells us, what we see in this passage, is that Jesus honors our ability to think. That he doesn't ask us to put away our minds. He doesn't ask us, oh shoot, I talked too long again. Okay. Thanks for the heads up. But he doesn't ask us to kind of put aside our ability to think or reason, but he invites us. To use them, believing that if we think well, our questions will actually lead us to him. Then the question is, how do we think well? And if thinking well is far more about questions than it ever is answers, the question is, what are the most important questions? And so when it comes to the spiritual emergency, I think you stop the bleeding really with these two questions. I think these are two of the most significant questions, sort of at the very beginning of the process. Number one, is truth real? And number two, is reality material only, or is it immaterial also? And these questions are significant because if the answer to the first question is no, if there is no truth, then we might as well kind of hang up our hats right now, because it doesn't really matter. If there is no truth, then we have nothing to build our lives on at all. If intuitively we build our lives on truth and truth does not exist, then we've got nothing to go on. And even if the answer to that question is yes, and the answer to the second one is no, if truth is only material in nature, then that means that basically we're born, we live, we die, we're buried, and that is pretty much it. There's no other greater significance to life beyond that. We are just purely physical and material beings. And so really that removes meaning and significance from life in a pretty dramatic way. But thankfully, while these questions are very significant, they're also, thankfully, not that difficult to answer. And so the first one, in getting at it, the answer to the first question, is truth real? I think is clearly yes. Because in order for the answer to be meaningful, it has to be yes. Because even the claim, if you answer the question saying, no, truth isn't real, that in and of itself is a claim that you're making that you believe to be true, which kind of defeats itself. And so I think intuitively we build our lives on truth because truth is a reality. And whichever way you answer the question, you are relying on truth to actually make an answer in the first place. And so we build our lives on truth because it is a reality. And I think sometimes this can be tricky in the midst of a spiritual emergency, because what can send us into a tailspin is the realization that everything we thought was true, everything we built our life on, isn't actually true. And that can lead us into a place where we're questioning all truth altogether. But if we're making the claim that something isn't true, that something is fundamentally false, that's a claim that actually relies on truth itself as well. And so something can't be false unless there's also something that is true. You don't get one without the other. In order for there to be truth and falsehood, they both have to exist. And so thankfully, the answer to the first question is yes, truth is real. And so we can find it, understand it, and build our lives upon it. The second question, is reality only material, or is it immaterial also? Is a significant question. But thankfully, it's not that much more significant, or not that much more difficult to answer either. There's one thing I'm not sure if we have time for it. I want to touch on it real quick. There's 3 tests of truth before we jump into the second question. It can be difficult to kind of sift through all the different kinds of knowledge and information in the midst of a spiritual crisis, right? And I think one helpful way to do that, if we know that truth is real, how do we understand what is true? And these are 3 tests that I think are particularly helpful for that. The tests are coherence, correspondence, and functional. And so to continue to riff on Taco Bell, let's say you've got a friend who says Taco Bell is the best restaurant in the world, and then they turn around 5 minutes later and say that Chili's is the best restaurant in the world. Those two statements cannot both be true because they fail the coherence test. Right? Both the statements are not coherent with one another. Both of them cannot be the best restaurant in the world. So you could modify, you could alter a little bit and say, well, Taco Bell isn't the best restaurant in the world, it's the best Mexican restaurant in the world. And that technically passes the coherence test, but it fails the correspondence test because that idea does not correspond with reality. But if you modify it again and say, Taco Bell is a decent place to get a cheap meal, then you pass all three because it coheres with other ideas, it corresponds with reality, and it's a functionally adequate truth, and that it's something you can reliably build your life upon. And so I think these three tests can be a helpful way to kind of sift through truth and information on the other side of a spiritual crisis. And so that's truth. Jumping into the second question, I think the easiest way to answer it is just to step back and realize that the question itself actually assumes an immaterial reality, because truth in its very nature is immaterial, as is logic and even the laws that govern it. Even things like mathematics, morality, the laws of physics, all of that is immaterial in nature. And so, of course, reality is both material and immaterial. You could say that logic and truth, you could push back and say that logic and truth are just sort of human-made concepts, right? They're sociological inventions, not independent realities. But I think anyone who would make that claim wouldn't also say that in order for 2 + 2 to equal 4, you need humans within the universe. That would be true whether or not we're actually here, which I think tells us that immaterial reality, it is real and it exists independent of us. Now, there's another argument here that I think is also helpful that kind of pairs some other things, but I'm gonna rush through it. So it pairs the law of cause and effect, which says if something is the effect, it cannot be the cause. So if there's a spider web, the spider web didn't cause itself. There's a spider that made it. There's a fastball that's thrown. There's a pitcher who threw it. If something's the effect, it cannot be the cause. At the same time, when we look at the universe, we know that it had a beginning because the heat within the universe is continuing to lessen and always has been and always will be. And what's interesting is that tells us that the universe was created at a certain point, that space-time and matter were brought into being, that they're not eternal realities. Because if they're eternal, the heat that actually sustains even our life in this very room right now would be gone. Right? The heat that makes our life possible, if the universe is not just really old, but actually eternal, going backwards in that direction in an infinite degree, then the temperature, the heat within the universe would already be gone. And so that tells us that there was a beginning point, right? That space, time, and matter were brought into being at a certain point in time. The law of cause and effect tells us that if whatever brought them into being created all space, time, and matter, that whatever created them must also be different, right? If these are the effect, then the cause must be separate. The cause must be something that is spaceless, that is timeless, that is powerful, and also immaterial in nature. So it's going again. So, all right, I don't know what you would call a being or something that matches those qualities, but I myself would attach the label God to something that is spaceless, timeless, immaterial, and powerful enough to bring all space, time, and matter into being. And so, again, that tells us that nature, reality, is material and immaterial in nature. All right. Okay, so moving on from that. Those are the two foundational questions. Obviously, that doesn't answer everything, but that at least gives us a foundation to work from, that we know there is truth, and that we know that there is a greater significance to life that is possible, that is out there to be found, because reality is not just material. We're not just physical beings that will die and go away at some point, but there's an immaterial nature to reality as well. All right, so moving into that, the fourth step is really all about beginning to build on that, to construct a worldview on top of these two fundamental pieces. And so something interesting about worldviews is that worldview is your understanding of reality. If you look at sort of the story of reality that we're living in, the answer to the question, what is reality? That's a worldview. And what's fascinating is every every religion, every kind of ideology has some worldview that matches these four different pieces of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. They don't all use this language, but they all follow this pattern. Even the movie, any Christopher Nolan fans in the room? All right, we got one. We got one in the back. Good stuff. The only one who saw Oppenheimer is long. Is a commitment. Yeah, okay. I saw it. I guess I'm the only one. Yeah, I enjoyed it. I walked out not knowing if it was a masterpiece or just okay. It was one or the other. But, so the film, I think you could classify Oppenheimer in this as well, but especially the Matthew McConaughey film with him, Interstellar, is like the perfect picture of sort of the modern project that, the Big Bang and macro evolution are sort of what brought the universe and humanity into being, and then with that, the fall is essentially that we're finite beings who don't live forever. We die, and we're very uncomfortable with that. We don't like that reality, and so we're trying to overcome it. That's the part of life that isn't right, and the tools that we lean on to overcome that are the modern project, engineering and science and modern medicine. The thought being that if we continue to give ourselves to these, if we devote ourselves to them, perhaps even in a religious sense, that one day they will bestow the favor upon us of giving us the ability to rise up, become our own Messiah, our own Savior, and find a way to achieve eternal life. And when we do so, that will be the restoration of all things. And so, even the most secular understanding of reality that you can find uses these four pieces of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. So the question is, if this seems to be just sort of a pattern of reality, then what is the story that fits them that is actually true? What is the story of reality that we're actually living within, is the question. And so, jumping into one other section of passages for today, kind of our last section of passages. This is the Apostle Paul in Acts chapter 17 having this conversation at what's called the Areopagus. Real quick, before we get to that. Faith is not the foundation of faith, sort of the key idea for what Paul is talking about here. Sometimes the thought can be that faith is the foundation of faith, that I believe something because I believe it, right? I believe it because it helps me to feel a particular way, or it produces these certain results within my life, within the lives of other people. But what we see within Paul's argument, one of the key ideas, is that faith isn't actually the foundation of faith, but truth is the foundation of faith. That another way to accurately translate the word faith in the New Testament is trust. And we place trust in something not just because it gives us a certain feeling, but because it is true. And so truth is the foundation of faith. And so that's what we're looking for when it comes to a worldview that we can trust because it is true. And this is what we see with Paul in his argument, him leaning into this understanding. So Acts chapter 17, this is Paul at the Areopagus, which is in the city of Athens, the center of all intellectual and philosophical activity in the Roman Empire. Right? These are sort of the brightest minds. And Paul gets the chance to stand before them and deliver the gospel message, his presentation for the gospel. This is what he says. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I am going to proclaim to you." In other words, Paul, he opens up by complimenting them, and then he calls out their own admission of their ignorance, the possibility that there is a God that exists that they do not know about. Paul says, I'm going to tell you about who that God is. This is what he goes on to say, verse 24. "The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands, as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands." And I think up until this point, they're with him. Right? This is even probably a familiar idea to them up until this point. They're Greek thinkers. They're thinking this is Aristotle's unmoved mover. This is Plato's perfect being, the one true God who's transcendent and over above all things. Right? They understand Paul until he says this. He goes on to say, God did this in verse 27 so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him. Though he is not far from any one of us. He makes the claim that this one true God, who is the creator of all things, is also interested in a relationship with you and me, which is very different from the other understandings of the one transcendent God that the Greeks had. And so Paul knows that this is a difficult idea for them to wrap their heads around, so he grounds his claim here, saying, quoting some of the poets, saying, "For in him we live and move and have our being, as some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring." Right? He uses some of their own cultural thinkers and writers in order to ground this idea. And then he continues on and moves into presenting actual evidence for the claims that he's making. Verse 29, "Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, or to accept the invitation into a relationship with God, the relationship with God that we are made for. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed." And notice this, he has given proof of this. He has presented evidence of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. And there, we see Paul lay out this understanding of reality, this worldview that begins with creation. God is the one who brought all things into being, including us. And he created us for a relationship with him. And yet, the fall, what is wrong with the world, is elsewhere Paul describes it using the word sin. Here he talks about ignorance, because the Greek mind didn't have as much of a category for sin as the Jewish mind did. He's kind of speaking directly to his audience here. But the fact that we've been severed from the relationship with God that we're made for. And redemption is that Jesus took on our humanity, lived the perfect life we couldn't, gave his life on the cross in our place for our sins, and then rose from the grave in order to invite us into the relationship with God that we were made for. The solution to the problem that is wrong with the world. And then he even highlights restoration here, saying that one day he will judge the world with justice. He will bring about the restoration of all things. And so we see that Paul fills in these four categories with those three words: God, sin, Jesus. And then he presents evidence backing up this claim that this is reality, which is the resurrection of Jesus. And that's why it's been said that the resurrection of Jesus is actually the linchpin of Christianity, that if he didn't rise from the grave, Paul even says this in 1 Corinthians 15, if he didn't rise, then we, of all people, are to be pitied, because what we've built our lives on isn't actually true. But if he has risen from the grave, then this is the story of reality that we're living in. And thankfully, there is a wealth of abundance, a wealth of evidence surrounding the resurrection of Jesus. And so, if it's true, what we can do is place trust within it. He also talks about evidence within 1 Corinthians 15. Talks about all of the people that Jesus appeared to after. It's basically saying you can go and talk to them and hear their testimony, people who interacted with Jesus on the other side of his resurrection. But you see that, go back to verse 32. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, because again, that was difficult for the Greek mind to accept, thinking that immaterial reality was better and higher than physical, crude reality. But others said, "We want to hear you again on this subject." And at that, Paul left the council. Some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. In other words, what they did is they placed trust in this understanding of reality because they believed it to be true. And I think when it comes to rebuilding a worldview in the aftermath of a spiritual emergency, it's easy to kind of jump ahead and almost get lost going into all of these different rabbit holes, all of these different questions that feel so urgent, right? A million questions going in a million different directions. And yet, by focusing on the questions that are most significant, I'm not saying that the other questions don't deserve answers, because they do, right? We believe that all questions deserve answers, but by building a foundation and an understanding of reality that we can then work from as we seek answers to all of the other questions, that gives us sort of a steady and a stable place to work from. And so that is what it looks like to prioritize the treatment, which is step number 4, to focus again on the most important questions. All right, we are rounding third base here and moving towards home. I don't know why I use baseball analogies. I was awful at it. Ross just gave me the 5. We got 5 minutes. Okay. So last couple ideas. I think the point of having a workshop like this is the idea that healing is easier when you understand the process. I have broken my wrist 3 different times in my life, and so I know when I break my wrist, which is likely to happen again, I know what it looks like to heal. Like 6 weeks in a cast, garbage bags and duct tape for the shower, and just try not to scratch down there. and that's the plan. And I think part of what's so difficult about a spiritual emergency is it's not clear to us what it looks like to heal, that the process of moving forward isn't something that is remarkably clear. And so the goal is to provide an understanding of the process that helps others move towards healing in a way that is more clear and more helpful. And so with that, if you want to grow spiritually, the 5th and final step being moving forward, you have to know what produces spiritual health. And I had another whiteboard discussion planned, but I think we're out of time. So with that, what produces spiritual health? I think what's interesting is the exercise we were going to do is basically have people write down the 2 or 3 most significant things that were catalysts for your spiritual growth in your life. And majority of the time, every one of our catalysts fall into one of these categories. This is from Pastor and author Andy Stanley. Practical teaching, teaching from the Bible that is helpful, hopeful, and clear and understandable. Providential relationships. I think you could look back to step number 2 and say finding the right people. The right people are providential relationships. Private disciplines, beginning to practice a regular time in the Bible and in prayer. Not to get something from God, but simply to grow in our relationship with Him. Number 4, personal ministry. There's also an interesting note there that I think in 2 Corinthians, Paul talks about how our suffering has given us the ability to come alongside others and support them in their own. And I think for those of us in this room who've been through a spiritual emergency, I think that's one hopeful note, that going through something as difficult as this actually equips you to be able to come alongside others in a way that someone like me never really could, but to provide help and support for them in that way. And so the number 5, pivotal circumstances, which I think you could say that even a spiritual emergency, as painful and as confusing as it can be, that is a pivotal circumstance for spiritual growth in a person's life. So those are the 5. I think as we come near to the end of the day, the question is just sort of, how can I move forward? And I think the truth is you move forward by taking one next step of trust at a time. That you don't need to have it all mapped out and know where you're going to be in a year or in 5 years or in 10, but just having an understanding of what the next step of trust looks like, I think is the most helpful place to start. And when it comes to those 5 steps of keep breathing, find the right people, stop the bleeding, prioritize the treatment, and move forward, you can think of them almost as different chapters within a book, and that they're one cohesive story. And sometimes the most helpful thing to do is to identify which chapter are you in. Right? Is it chapter 2, trying to find the right people? Is it chapter 4, trying to reconstruct an understanding of reality? Maybe it's chapter 5, that things have steadied out, but you're trying to figure out what does it look like to continue growing from here. And I think understanding what chapter you're in will help clarify what that next step of trust is for you in this particular season. And then finally, I think I just close with this. That my son, right, he still has a scar on his knee from the wound that he got several years ago now. The wound is gone, he doesn't feel anything, but yet the scar is still there, the evidence of the emergency that he went through. And I think the truth is, if you've been through a spiritual emergency yourself, the scar is still there as well. And it's not necessarily anything that you can see because the wound wasn't physical. And yet it's there in the form of the memories and the pain that you went through. And I think if there's something to take away from that, is that those scars aren't necessarily a bad thing. Because one interesting thing that the Bible presents about Jesus is that even on the other side of the resurrection, as we saw with Thomas, the wounds from the cross are still there. Right? Even in his glorified, resurrected body, the evidence of what he went through to bring us life is still there. And I thank you that you were willing to go through suffering on our behalf as well, so that we could find life and we could build our lives on truth with you. And I pray that you would just make it clear to each one of us what it looks like to continue growing in our relationship with you, as we continue to take one next step of trust at a time, as we build a life on truth with you. In your name, amen.